The restaurant sat on the corner of a busy street, shining under golden lights every evening. It was called the Crystal Spoon, a place where only the rich and powerful came to eat. From the outside, it looked like a dream. Glass doors, velvet curtains, and expensive cars lined up at the entrance. But for the people who worked there, it wasn't always a dream. Behind the smiles and polite greetings, there was a quiet fear that spread through the staff whenever one particular customer came in. That customer was Mrs. Veronica Hale, the wife of one of the city's richest businessmen. Everyone knew her name. Everyone feared her. She was beautiful, dressed in the finest designer clothes, always wearing diamond jewelry that sparkled like little stars. But what sparkled more than her jewels was her arrogance. She walked into the restaurant like she owned the place, her chin high, her eyes cold. Whenever she entered, it felt as if the air itself became heavier. The waiters would quickly fix their uniforms, the manager would straighten his tie, and the chefs would prepare for another tense night. Mrs. Hale had a reputation, a bad one. She was known for finding mistakes that didn't exist. If her glass wasn't filled to the perfect level, she complained. If the soup wasn't hot enough, she sent it back. Sometimes, she even insulted the staff just to make herself feel important. The employees didn't dare talk back. They needed their jobs, and the restaurant couldn't afford to lose such a wealthy client. Every Friday evening, around 7 o'clock, Mrs. Hale's black luxury car would pull up to the entrance. The valet would open the door, and she would step out gracefully, her heels clicking on the marble floor. The moment she entered, whispers spread through the restaurant. "She's here," someone would say softly. The atmosphere changed instantly. Laughter stopped. Everyone started moving faster, trying to make everything perfect before she could complain about something. Mr. Hale, her husband, always came with her, but he was quiet, too quiet. He seemed tired, sitting at the table while his wife gave endless orders. Sometimes he tried to calm her down, but she always silenced him with one sharp look. Most people felt sorry for him. He looked like a man trapped in a world made of gold and unhappiness. The restaurant staff had seen it all before. One week, Mrs. Hale shouted at a waitress because she didn't smile enough. Another time, she made a young waiter cry just because the bread wasn't warm. Everyone who worked at the Crystal Spoon had a story about her cruelty. Some employees even requested to leave early on Fridays just to avoid dealing with her. The manager, Mr. Peterson, was especially nervous on those nights. He was a kind man, but he couldn't risk losing Mrs. Hale as a customer. Her husband was one of the restaurant's biggest investors. If she complained too much, the restaurant could lose funding, and people could lose their jobs. So, every time she visited, he gave his team the same speech. "Remember, everyone," he would say. "Be polite. Don't argue. Do whatever she asks. Smile no matter what she says." The staff nodded, but deep inside, they felt angry. Why should they be treated like this just because someone had money? Still, they followed orders. That's what working at the Crystal Spoon meant. Serving the rich no matter how badly they treated you. The kitchen, usually full of noise and laughter, became silent when Mrs. Hale was there. The chefs moved quickly, checking every plate twice. They didn't want to risk her throwing a tantrum. The waiters spoke in whispers, glancing nervously at her table. Even the soft music playing in the background couldn't hide the tension. Mrs. Hale loved the attention. She noticed how everyone watched her carefully, afraid of upsetting her. It made her feel powerful, almost like a queen among servants. She often leaned back in her chair and said things like, "People these days have no sense of class," or, "You can't expect good service anymore." Her friends laughed politely, pretending to agree, while the staff bit their tongues and smiled through their frustration. One evening, a new group of diners sat nearby and whispered, "Is that the famous Mrs. Hale?" They watched her closely, both impressed and shocked by how rudely she spoke to the workers. To them, she looked like someone who had everything: beauty, money, and influence. But to the waiters, she was a nightmare wrapped in luxury. The saddest part was how normal it all had become. The staff no longer expected kindness from her. They just waited for the night to end, counting the hours until she left. When her car finally drove away, they all sighed in relief. The kitchen staff clapped quietly, and someone always joked, "We survived another Friday." But no one ever dared to speak against her, not yet. The fear of losing their jobs was stronger than their pride. They told themselves it wasn't worth it. It was easier to stay silent. Little did they know change was coming. A new waitress would soon join the Crystal Spoon, someone who didn't believe that money gave anyone the right to look down on others. Someone who would see through the glitter and arrogance, and dare to speak up when no one else would. For now, though, the Crystal Spoon remained a place of quiet fear and hidden frustration. Every waiter's heart would race when Mrs. Hale entered. Every smile was forced. Every "yes, ma'am" was spoken carefully. It was a restaurant of elegance on the outside, but underneath, it was a place ruled by one woman's cruelty. And everyone wondered how long it would stay that way. The next morning at the Crystal Spoon, the air felt different. The staff was busy polishing glasses, folding napkins, and checking tables. But there was also a quiet curiosity in the air. A new waitress was joining the team. New workers didn't usually last long here, especially once they met Mrs. Hale. Still, everyone hoped the new girl would at least make it through the first week. Around 10 o'clock, the glass door opened, and in walked Sophie Miller. She was in her early 20s, with warm brown eyes and a kind smile that seemed to light up her whole face. She didn't look nervous, just calm and polite. Her uniform was a little too big, and her hair was tied in a neat ponytail. She greeted the staff with a friendly, "Good morning," and everyone turned to look at her. The manager, Mr. Peterson, came forward and smiled weakly. "You must be Sophie," he said. "Welcome to the Crystal Spoon. We're happy to have you." Sophie smiled back. "Thank you, sir. I'm excited to start." The other waiters exchanged glances. They had seen this before. A new person, full of hope, unaware of what was waiting for them. Still, Sophie's positive energy made them like her right away. She seemed different. As the day went on, Sophie learned quickly. She balanced trays perfectly, remembered table numbers after hearing them once, and treated every customer with genuine kindness. When she served coffee, she made sure it was just the right temperature. When she smiled, it didn't feel fake. It was warm and real. Even the grumpy chef in the kitchen, who rarely spoke kindly to anyone, said, "This one's got a good heart." But during lunch break, one of the senior waitresses, Emma, sat beside Sophie and said softly, "You seem nice, Sophie, but there's something you should know." Sophie looked up curiously. "What is it?" Emma leaned closer. "Every Friday, Mrs. Veronica Hale comes here. She's not like the other customers. She's powerful, rich, and very hard to please. Everyone's scared of her." Sophie frowned slightly. "Scared? Of a customer?" Emma nodded quickly. "You don't understand. She yells at people for the smallest things. Last month, she made Lucy cry just because she brought the wrong kind of lemon. And the worst part? The manager can't say anything because her husband invests money in this restaurant. If she complains, someone might lose their job." Sophie stayed quiet for a moment. Then she smiled gently. "Thanks for the warning, Emma. But I think everyone deserves respect, even the rude ones. Maybe she's just unhappy." Emma sighed. "You'll see for yourself. Just don't talk back to her. That's the rule." Sophie nodded, but inside, she didn't fully agree. She had worked in small diners before, places where people were kind and treated each other like family. She believed respect was something everyone should give and receive, no matter how rich or poor they were. Over the next few days, Sophie watched how the restaurant changed when rich customers came in. The staff became quieter, more careful, and a little less human. Smiles were forced, laughter disappeared, and every move was made with fear of being scolded. Sophie didn't like that feeling. On Thursday evening, when the restaurant closed, She stayed behind to help clean up. Mr. Peterson noticed and said, "You don't have to stay, Sophie. Go home. It's late." She smiled. "I don't mind. I like to make sure everything's perfect for tomorrow." The manager smiled softly. "You're a good worker. But tomorrow is Friday." Sophie looked at him, confused. "And," he sighed, "it means Mrs. Hale will be here. I just hope she doesn't notice you. She likes to test new staff." That night, Sophie went home thinking about it. She wasn't afraid, but she did feel curious. Why would someone act that way toward people who were only trying to do their jobs? What made a person so unkind? She promised herself that no matter what happened, she would stay calm and respectful. Friday arrived faster than she expected. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the restaurant was shining. The chandeliers were glowing, the silverware sparkled, and everyone was on edge. Sophie could feel the nervous energy all around her. Emma whispered, "She'll be here any minute. Just stay out of her way." Sophie nodded but stood tall. She had dealt with rude customers before. Maybe Mrs. Hale was just misunderstood. Then, at exactly 7 o'clock, the sound of expensive heels echoed across the marble floor. The door opened, and there she was, Mrs. Veronica Hale. She looked like she had stepped out of a magazine. Her long black dress shimmered, her diamond necklace caught the light, and her perfume filled the room. Everyone froze for a second. Even the music seemed to fade. Sophie watched quietly as Mrs. Hale sat at her usual table, the one near the window. The manager rushed over, bowing slightly. "Good evening, Mrs. Hale. It's wonderful to see you again." Mrs. Hale didn't even look at him. "I'll have my usual," she said coldly, tapping her nails on the table. The staff hurried to prepare her order. Sophie noticed how scared everyone looked. The older waiters avoided her table completely, whispering excuses to stay in the kitchen. But when the food was ready, Mr. Peterson turned to Sophie. His face looked worried. "Sophie," he said quietly, "can you take this to Mrs. Hale's table? The others are busy." Sophie hesitated for a second, then nodded. She lifted the tray carefully and walked across the room. Every eye was on her. The new girl walking straight toward the woman everyone feared. She placed the dish in front of Mrs. Hale and smiled politely. "Good evening, ma'am. I hope you enjoy your meal." Mrs. Hale looked up slowly, her eyes cold and sharp. "You're new," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Sophie replied. "My name is Sophie." Mrs. Hale raised an eyebrow. "Let's see if you can at least carry a plate without trembling." Her friends at the table laughed softly, but Sophie didn't flinch. Her voice stayed calm, her smile steady. "I'll do my best, ma'am." For a moment, Mrs. Hale stared at her, almost surprised by the girl's confidence. Then she looked away, pretending to lose interest. But something in her expression showed that she wasn't used to such calmness. And so the night began, the night that would change everything at the Crystal Spoon. The new waitress had just met the woman everyone feared, and neither of them knew that this meeting would soon shake both their worlds. Friday night at the Crystal Spoon was always the same, full of nervous energy and quiet tension. Every waiter moved quickly, every chef double-checked every plate, and every eye stayed on the door, waiting for her to arrive. By 7 o'clock, everyone knew what was coming. Outside, a long black luxury car stopped in front of the restaurant. The valet hurried to open the door, bowing slightly. Out stepped Mrs. Veronica Hale, the woman who made even the toughest staff members nervous. She was dressed in a deep blue silk gown that shimmered like water under the golden lights. Diamonds sparkled on her fingers, and her perfume filled the air before she even entered the room. Inside, the restaurant went completely silent for a second. The manager rushed to greet her with his most careful smile. "Good evening, Mrs. Hale," he said politely. "Your table is ready as always." Mrs. Hale gave him a brief nod without even making eye contact. "I expect the same standard as usual, Mr. Peterson," she said coldly. "Let's hope your new staff don't ruin my night." Her words made Sophie glance up from the corner where she was setting a tray. She had only met Mrs. Hale briefly when she first arrived earlier that evening, but now she could feel exactly what everyone had warned her about. The woman's presence alone made the room colder. Mrs. Hale walked gracefully to her favorite table by the window. Behind her, two women followed, her friends, both equally well-dressed but much quieter. They smiled nervously at her jokes, the kind of fake smiles people gave when they were too afraid to disagree. Sophie took a deep breath as Mr. Peterson called her name. "Sophie, table 3, Mrs. Hale's order," he said, trying to sound calm. "You can handle it, right?" Sophie nodded. "Of course, sir." She carried the tray carefully, walking toward the table. Her hands were steady, her expression calm. But inside, her heart beat a little faster. She could feel every pair of eyes watching her. When Sophie reached the table, she gave a polite smile. "Good evening, ma'am. Welcome back to the Crystal Spoon. May I take your order?" Mrs. Hale looked up slowly, her sharp eyes scanning Sophie from head to toe. "You're the new girl," she said, her tone filled with arrogance. "Let's see if you can at least carry a plate without trembling." Her friends laughed quietly, but Sophie didn't let it bother her. She simply smiled politely and said, "I'll do my best, ma'am." Mrs. Hale raised an eyebrow, almost as if she didn't like how calm the girl was. "Do your best? I don't accept best. I expect perfection." "Yes, ma'am," Sophie replied softly. "I'll make sure everything is perfect." Something in her gentle, respectful voice seemed to annoy Mrs. Hale even more. She wasn't used to people staying calm around her. Most waiters shook, stammered, or looked terrified. But this girl, she stood tall, calm, and polite. It made Mrs. Hale feel strangely challenged, though she couldn't understand why. Sophie took the order quickly, writing it down with steady hands. She smiled at Mrs. Hale's friends and thanked them kindly before walking back to the kitchen. The staff members waiting near the counter immediately gathered around her. "How was it?" whispered Emma. Sophie shrugged lightly. "She's firm, but I'll manage." Emma sighed. "You'll see. It's only the beginning." When Sophie returned with the first round of dishes, she noticed Mrs. Hale wasn't eating. She was watching. Every movement Sophie made, every step, every gesture, Mrs. Hale's eyes followed, like she was waiting for a mistake. Finally, as Sophie served a glass of water, Mrs. Hale said loudly enough for half the restaurant to hear, "Do you know how long we've been coming here?" Sophie smiled politely. "No, ma'am." "5 years," Mrs. Hale said, lifting her chin proudly. "And I've seen more clumsy waiters than I can count. Let's hope you don't add to that list." Sophie didn't say a word. She simply nodded and replied, "I'll try my best to make your evening pleasant." Her calm tone only made Mrs. Hale more irritated. She wasn't used to kindness that didn't come from fear. After a few minutes, the food arrived, perfectly cooked, beautifully arranged, just as Mrs. Hale liked it. Sophie placed the plates gently on the table. "Your dinner, ma'am," she said with a kind smile. Mrs. Hale didn't thank her. She just stared at the food for a few seconds, then picked up her fork and took a small bite. The other guests at her table began eating too, though none of them looked relaxed. They ate carefully, afraid of saying or doing something that might annoy her. Sophie stood at a distance, watching quietly, ready to help if needed. She noticed how everyone, even Mrs. Hale's friends, seemed uncomfortable around her. No one laughed freely. Every word was chosen carefully. It made Sophie feel sad. She couldn't understand how someone with so much wealth could be so unhappy inside. Then, suddenly, Mrs. Hale looked up and called out sharply, "Waitress!" Sophie hurried over immediately. "Yes, ma'am? Is everything all right?" Mrs. Hale frowned. "This steak, it's slightly overcooked. Don't you people know how to follow instructions?" Sophie blinked in surprise. The steak looked perfect, but she kept her voice calm. "I'm very sorry, ma'am. I'll replace it right away." "You'd better," Mrs. Hale snapped. "I'm not paying for careless service." Sophie picked up the plate carefully and walked back to the kitchen. The other waiters stared at her, their faces full of sympathy. "See," whispered Emma, "it doesn't matter what you do. She'll always find something to complain about." In the kitchen, Sophie handed the plate to the chef and said softly, "She said it's overcooked. Can you please make another one?" The chef sighed heavily. It's perfect, but all right. While waiting for the new dish, Sophie leaned against the counter, trying to stay calm. She wasn't angry, just disappointed. She thought of all the people who worked so hard in this restaurant, only to be treated like they didn't matter. When the steak was ready, Sophie carried it back to Mrs. Hale's table. She set it down gently and said, "Here you go, ma'am. I hope this is better." Mrs. Hale didn't reply. She took a bite, then waved her hand dismissively. "Fine," she muttered. Sophie smiled again, still polite. She turned to leave, but not before noticing something. For a brief moment, Mrs. Hale looked surprised. Maybe she expected Sophie to be upset or scared, but Sophie's calmness seemed to unsettle her. The rest of the evening passed quietly. Mrs. Hale finished her meal without another complaint, though she gave Sophie cold glances every time she walked by. The other waiters watched in awe. The new girl had survived her first night with Mrs. Hale, something few had managed before. As the restaurant began to empty, Sophie cleaned the last table and smiled softly to herself. She didn't realize it yet, but that night, she had left an impression. Not just on the staff, but on Mrs. Hale too. For the first time, the feared millionaire's wife had met someone she couldn't intimidate, and it wouldn't be the last time they clashed. The next Friday evening, the Crystal Spoon was busier than usual. Every table was booked, and the sound of quiet chatter filled the room. The chandeliers glowed warmly, and the waiters moved quickly between tables, trying their best to keep up. But even with all the noise and movement, everyone's attention kept drifting toward one table, the one by the large window. That was Mrs. Veronica Hale's table. She sat there as always, elegant and untouchable, wearing a red dress that matched the lipstick on her perfect smile. But it wasn't a kind smile. It was sharp, the kind that made people nervous. Her husband sat beside her, silent as usual, and across from her were two of her friends, who laughed too loudly at every rude comment she made. Sophie was serving nearby, keeping her usual calm smile. It had been almost a week since her first meeting with Mrs. Hale. She remembered how the woman had mocked her, but Sophie hadn't taken it personally. She believed that kindness should never depend on someone else's behavior. So, even though others avoided Mrs. Hale's table, Sophie didn't. She served with quiet confidence, the same way she treated every customer. But that night, things were different. When Sophie walked over with a tray of soup, she could already sense trouble. Mrs. Hale was frowning, tapping her nails impatiently on the table. "Finally," she said sharply. "Do you all cook in slow motion here?" "I apologize for the wait, ma'am," Sophie said softly, setting the bowl down in front of her. The chef wanted to make sure it was prepared perfectly. Mrs. Hale gave her a cold look. "We'll see if it's perfect," she muttered. Sophie stepped back, standing nearby in case the table needed anything else. The restaurant was full, but the space around Mrs. Hale's table felt silent, heavy, like everyone was waiting for her next outburst. Mrs. Hale lifted her spoon and took a small sip of the soup. She paused for a moment, then suddenly slammed the spoon down on the table, making the glasses shake. "This soup is lukewarm," she shouted, her voice echoing across the restaurant. The chatter around the room stopped instantly. All eyes turned toward her. Sophie's heart jumped, but she kept her voice calm. "I'm very sorry, ma'am. I can take it back and bring you a fresh bowl right away." Mrs. Hale narrowed her eyes. "Do you think sorry fixes incompetence?" The question cut through the air like a knife. Sophie opened her mouth to speak, but Mrs. Hale didn't give her the chance. "I come here every week and spend more than some of you make in a month," she said loudly. "And this is how I'm treated? A simple bowl of soup, and you can't even serve it hot." Her friends looked uncomfortable, glancing down at their plates. Her husband sighed quietly, rubbing his forehead, but said nothing. He was used to this. Everyone was. Sophie stood still, her cheeks slightly flushed but her posture straight. She could feel everyone in the restaurant staring. Some looked angry, others looked sorry for her. The manager, Mr. Peterson, stood near the counter, frozen, too afraid to step in. Taking a slow breath, Sophie nodded. "I understand, ma'am," she said softly. I'll replace it immediately. Without another word, she picked up the bowl and walked back to the kitchen. The silence behind her felt heavy, and as soon as she disappeared behind the kitchen doors, the whispers began. Poor girl, one waiter muttered. That woman never changes. Emma shook her head. She does this every time. She just enjoys humiliating people. Sophie placed the bowl on the counter. She said it's lukewarm, she told the chef quietly. The chef frowned, touching the bowl. It's not lukewarm. It's perfect. Sophie smiled weakly. I know, but we'll make her another one anyway. While waiting for the new bowl, Sophie stood quietly in the corner. She wasn't angry, just sad. Sad that someone so powerful could treat others this way and feel proud about it. She thought about how Mrs. Hale's friends didn't dare correct her, how her husband stayed silent, and how everyone around her acted as if she was untouchable. Maybe that was the problem. No one had ever told her she was wrong. When the soup was ready, steaming hot this time, Sophie carried it out again. She walked with the same calmness as before, her steps steady, her eyes gentle. Here you go, ma'am, she said politely. A fresh bowl. I hope this is more to your liking. Mrs. Hale looked up, surprised that Sophie didn't look scared or upset. She had expected tears or trembling hands, but the young waitress looked perfectly composed. That somehow irritated her even more. Let's hope you got it right this time, Mrs. Hale said, picking up her spoon again. She tasted the soup, paused, then leaned back in her chair. It's fine, she said finally, her tone full of pride, as if she had trained Sophie personally. Sophie smiled slightly. I'm glad it's fine now, ma'am. Mrs. Hale gave her a long, cold look. You're very calm for someone who was just scolded, she said. Do you not care when customers are unhappy? Sophie met her gaze respectfully. I care a lot, ma'am. That's why I try to fix things without making them worse. For a few seconds, Mrs. Hale said nothing. Her lips tightened, and she looked away. It was clear she wasn't used to people answering her so calmly. Usually, they apologized over and over, panicked, or even cried. But Sophie's gentle tone left her with no power to continue her drama. The rest of the dinner went on quietly. Mrs. Hale occasionally threw a rude comment toward the kitchen or her husband, but Sophie never reacted. She served gracefully, thanked politely, and left a sense of quiet strength in every step she took. When the Hales finally left, the entire staff sighed in relief. Emma rushed over to Sophie, whispering, "You did amazing. She couldn't even get under your skin." Sophie smiled, wiping her hands on her apron. I just treated her the way I'd want to be treated, even if she doesn't do the same. The manager approached her with a tired smile. You handled that better than anyone I've ever seen, he said. Most people would have broken down. Sophie shrugged softly. Maybe she just needs someone to remind her that people are human too. That night, as Sophie walked home under the streetlights, she thought about Mrs. Hale. She didn't hate her. She just felt sorry for her. Sorry that someone so rich could be so empty inside. But what Sophie didn't know was that her calmness had left a mark on everyone who saw it. The customers, the staff, even Mrs. Hale herself. None of them would forget the quiet strength of the new waitress who refused to let cruelty change her kindness. The next week at the Crystal Spoon started off normally. The mornings were quiet, the staff moved efficiently, and customers came and went without trouble. But everyone knew that Friday was coming, and that meant Mrs. Veronica Hale would return. The moment her name was mentioned, the waiters exchanged nervous looks. Some even whispered, "Let's hope she's in a good mood this time." Sophie, however, didn't seem worried. She continued her work with the same gentle smile she always had. She was polite to every customer, careful with every dish, and kind to every coworker. Even the kitchen staff liked her because she never raised her voice, even when things went wrong. By Friday evening, the restaurant was glowing as always. The tables were covered in white cloths, the chandeliers sparkled, and soft music played in the background. But beneath the calm surface, everyone was tense. The moment Mrs. Hale's car pulled up, the air changed. She walked in wearing a silver gown that glittered under the lights, her diamonds catching every eye in the room. As always, people fell silent when she entered. She loved that moment, the power she held, the attention she received. "Good evening, Mrs. Hale," said Mr. Peterson, the manager, bowing slightly. She gave him a cold smile. "Let's make sure tonight goes better than last week," she said sharply, her tone full of warning. Sophie stood near the counter holding a tray. Her eyes met Mrs. Hale's for a brief second before she quickly looked away. She had no fear, but she didn't want to start another scene. Still, a strange feeling told her that something different might happen tonight. Mrs. Hale sat at her usual table by the window, surrounded by her friends again. They laughed too loudly and nodded too quickly, clearly trying to stay on her good side. Her husband, Mr. Hale, was there too, quiet as ever, scrolling through his phone, pretending not to notice his wife's arrogance. As Sophie approached their table, she could hear Mrs. Hale's voice, loud and sharp. "I don't know why it's so hard to find good service these days," she was saying. "People just don't care anymore." Her friends laughed obediently. Sophie set down the drinks and smiled politely. "Here are your beverages, ma'am. Would you like to order now?" Mrs. Hale barely looked at her. "Bring me the lobster bisque and the steak, medium rare this time. Not like last week's disaster." "Yes, ma'am," Sophie said calmly, writing it down. Mrs. Hale's friend added, "You're new, aren't you? You're brave for serving this table." Sophie just smiled. "Everyone deserves good service," she said simply. She returned to the kitchen and passed the order to the chef. The chef sighed and said, "That woman again. Let's make sure everything's perfect. We don't need another shouting scene." When the food was ready, Sophie carefully arranged the plates on her tray and walked back toward the table. She was almost there when she overheard Mrs. Hale speaking in a low, cruel tone. "I don't understand why they hire people like her," Mrs. Hale said. "She looks too simple for this place. Probably from some small town trying to act classy." Her friends chuckled uncomfortably. Sophie stopped in her tracks, her heart tightening. The words stung not because they were true, but because they showed how carelessly cruel Mrs. Hale could be. Still, she took a deep breath and continued walking. She placed the dishes on the table with her usual calm grace. "Here you go, ma'am. I hope everything is perfect this time." Mrs. Hale took a small sip of the soup, then smirked. "Well, at least it's hot. Maybe you're learning something." Sophie smiled softly. "I try my best every day, ma'am." The dinner went on for a while without trouble. But as Sophie stood nearby, ready to refill glasses, she overheard something that made her stop again. Mrs. Hale had leaned toward her friends, laughing quietly. "You know, people like them should be grateful we even let them serve us. They don't belong in places like this," she said. Her words were cruel, sharp, and meant to hurt. A few people at nearby tables turned to look at her, shocked by what they heard. Sophie felt her face grow warm, not from embarrassment, but from disappointment. She had stayed calm through every insult, every rude comment. But now, hearing those words, something inside her shifted. She realized that if no one ever stood up to Mrs. Hale, she would keep treating people like they were less than her. And maybe, just maybe, it was time someone said something. Sophie walked over to the table. She didn't raise her voice, and she didn't lose her smile. Her tone was gentle but steady. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I couldn't help overhearing what you said." Mrs. Hale looked up sharply. "Excuse me? Are you eavesdropping now?" "No, ma'am," Sophie said politely. "I just wanted to say that everyone here works hard to make your evening perfect. We take pride in what we do. But respect is a two-way street." The entire restaurant went silent. Even the music seemed to fade. All eyes turned toward Sophie. The waiters froze, the manager's mouth fell open, and Mrs. Hale's friends stared in shock. "What did you just say?" Mrs. Hale asked, her voice dangerously low. Sophie didn't flinch. "I said no one deserves to be spoken to like that. Not me, not the staff, not anyone. We may serve you, but we still deserve kindness." Gasps rippled through the restaurant. Mrs. Hale's face turned red. From anger or embarrassment, no one could tell. Her husband looked up from his phone, surprised. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, for the first time, he spoke in a calm but firm voice. "She's right, Veronica. Enough." The words hit Mrs. Hale harder than she expected. She stared at her husband, shocked. He had never stood up to her before. Not once. Around them, everyone remained silent, waiting for her reaction. For the first time, Mrs. Hale didn't know what to say. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Sophie simply bowed her head politely. "Thank you for understanding, ma'am," she said, then quietly walked back toward the counter. The restaurant stayed silent for several long seconds. Then, slowly, people began to whisper. Some were smiling. Others looked amazed. A few even clapped quietly, trying not to make a scene. Mrs. Hale sat there, her face pale and her pride wounded. She had been publicly corrected by a waitress, and in front of everyone. That night, something changed. Sophie hadn't shouted or disrespected her. She had simply spoken the truth with calm courage. And that truth had shaken the most feared woman in the city. From that moment on, the crystal spoon would never feel the same again, and neither would Mrs. Hale. The next morning, the story about what happened at the crystal spoon spread faster than anyone could imagine. By lunchtime, almost everyone in the restaurant industry had heard about it. The waitress who stood up to Mrs. Hale. Some people didn't believe it at first. Others said Sophie must have lost her job. But the truth was, she hadn't. Mr. Peterson, the manager, had been shocked during the incident. But after thinking it over that night, he realized Sophie had done something no one else had the courage to do. She hadn't been rude or disrespectful. She had simply spoken with dignity. And in a strange way, everyone who worked at the restaurant felt lighter the next day. The tension that used to hang in the air whenever Mrs. Hale's name was mentioned seemed to fade. The staff moved with more confidence. The laughter in the kitchen returned, and people whispered, "Did you see how calm Sophie was? She didn't even raise her voice." Even customers who had been there that night started telling others about it. One woman told her husband, "That waitress had such grace. She didn't insult anyone, but her words hit harder than any argument could." Soon, people began coming to the Crystal Spoon just to see the waitress who stood up to the feared millionaire's wife. Sophie, however, didn't enjoy the attention. She just wanted to do her job. She never talked about what happened. When coworkers praised her, she smiled and said, "I only said what needed to be said." Deep inside, though, she hoped Mrs. Hale might actually think about her words. Meanwhile, Mrs. Hale had not been seen since that night. She hadn't returned to the restaurant, and everyone wondered if she ever would. Some thought she was too embarrassed to show her face again. Others guessed she was plotting revenge. But the truth was more complicated. That night, when she had gone home, her husband hadn't spoken to her during the entire car ride. The silence was heavier than any argument. When they reached their mansion, he quietly said, "You've gone too far, Veronica." Then he walked away, leaving her speechless. For the first time, Mrs. Hale sat alone, replaying Sophie's calm voice in her mind. "Respect is a two-way street." Those words kept echoing. At first, she tried to brush them off, telling herself that the girl was just being dramatic. But as hours passed, something in her heart began to ache. She remembered her younger years, before all the wealth and luxury. She hadn't always been like this. There was a time when she had been kind, warm, and full of dreams. But somewhere along the way, pride had taken over. She had become someone she barely recognized, a woman who made others fear her instead of respect her. Her reflection in the mirror that night didn't look like the confident, powerful woman she pretended to be. It looked like someone lonely. For days she stayed quiet. Her friends called, gossiping about the scene at the restaurant, but she didn't answer. Even her husband avoided her. For the first time in years, Mrs. Hale felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: regret. Back at the restaurant, life returned to normal, though everyone secretly wondered if Mrs. Hale would ever come back. One evening, about a week later, a black car pulled up in front of the Crystal Spoon. The valet froze. The staff peeked out from behind the counter. "It's her," someone whispered. Mr. Peterson straightened his jacket nervously. Sophie was at another table serving a family with 2 kids. She looked up calmly and nodded. "It's okay," she said softly. "Let's just do our job." Mrs. Hale entered the restaurant, but something about her was different. She wasn't wearing her usual flashy jewelry or expensive designer clothes. Instead, she wore a simple navy dress, her hair tied back neatly. Her expression wasn't cold or arrogant. It was humble. The restaurant went silent, waiting for her to snap or complain. But instead, she walked slowly to the counter and said quietly, "Is Sophie here?" The manager blinked in surprise. "Why yes, Mrs. Hale. She's serving table 3. Mrs. Hale turned and saw Sophie smiling kindly at the family. For a moment, she hesitated, her pride whispering for her to walk away. But then she took a deep breath and walked over. Sophie noticed her and put down her tray. "Good evening, Mrs. Hale," she said politely, her voice calm as always. Mrs. Hale looked at her, eyes soft. "Good evening," she said after a pause. "May I speak with you for a moment?" The restaurant fell silent again. Everyone watched as the feared woman and the brave waitress stepped to the side. Mrs. Hale took a breath and said, "I came here today to apologize. What I said to you and to everyone here was wrong. I've been rude and cruel, and I'm ashamed of it. You didn't deserve that." The staff stared in disbelief. Some nearly dropped their trays. No one had ever seen Mrs. Hale apologize to anyone, not even her husband. Sophie smiled gently. "Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate that more than you know." Mrs. Hale nodded, her eyes glistening slightly. "Your words that night, they made me realize something. I've spent so long trying to be respected that I forgot how to respect others. You reminded me of that." Sophie didn't gloat or act proud. She just said, "Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is that you see them and change." Mrs. Hale gave a small smile, a genuine one this time. "Would you allow me to dine here again? This time, I promise to be a better customer." Sophie nodded. "Of course, ma'am. You're always welcome here." When Mrs. Hale sat down, the restaurant slowly filled with quiet whispers. But this time, there was no fear, only curiosity and admiration. The woman who once made everyone nervous now sat quietly, saying please and thank you to every staff member who served her. Even Mr. Hale looked surprised when he arrived later that evening. His wife greeted him kindly, asked about his day, and smiled at Sophie when she served them. The staff exchanged amazed looks. The change was real. By the end of the night, Mrs. Hale left a generous tip for every waiter, including Sophie. She paused at the door, looked around and said softly, "This restaurant feels warmer than it used to." After she left, the kitchen erupted in quiet applause. Mr. Peterson turned to Sophie and said, "You didn't just stand up to her. You changed her." Sophie smiled humbly. "No," she said. "She changed herself. I just reminded her who she used to be." From that night on, the Crystal Spoon was never the same. The place that once felt tense and fearful became full of laughter again. The staff moved freely, customers felt welcome, and even Mrs. Hale became one of their most polite guests. It turned out that sometimes, one kind but brave voice can do what fear never could. It can change hearts. Weeks passed, and the Crystal Spoon became a completely different place. The restaurant that was once filled with quiet fear and nervous whispers now buzzed with energy and laughter. Customers noticed the difference too. The staff smiled more, the atmosphere felt lighter, and everyone seemed happier. But the biggest change of all was Mrs. Hale. She visited the restaurant every Friday, just like before, but now she was almost unrecognizable. The woman who once shouted over tiny mistakes and treated people like they were beneath her now greeted everyone warmly. She remembered people's names, asked how their day was going, and even complimented the food. The first time she returned after her apology, everyone was cautious. The waiters whispered to each other, "Maybe it's just for one night. Maybe she'll go back to her old self." But she didn't. She had truly changed. Whenever Sophie walked past her table, Mrs. Hale smiled genuinely. Sometimes she even said things like, "Sophie, your service is always wonderful." Or, "You have such patience. It's admirable." The staff almost couldn't believe their ears. Even Mr. Hale looked different now. Before, he used to sit quietly beside his wife, looking tired and small. But now he smiled more. He talked, he laughed, and the tension that used to hang between them was gone. People who saw them together said, "They actually look happy now." One evening, after closing time, the staff gathered around a table for dinner, something they never used to do before. Mr. Peterson, the manager, looked around proudly. "I have to say," he began, "this restaurant feels alive again. And it's because one person had the courage to speak up." All eyes turned to Sophie. She blushed and shook her head. "It wasn't courage," she said softly. "It was just honesty. People forget that kindness and respect go both ways." The others nodded. Even the chef, who was known for being grumpy, smiled. "Maybe," he said. But no one else had the guts to say it to her face. That night, as Sophie walked home, she thought about how much had changed. It felt strange, in a good way, that something so small, just a few calm words, could make such a big difference. She wasn't just proud of herself. She was proud of how everyone had grown braver and kinder since that day. A few days later, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Hale requested to meet Sophie before dinner service. The manager called her into his office, where Mrs. Hale stood waiting, holding a small envelope in her hand. "Sophie," she said gently, "I wanted to thank you again. What you said that night, it changed me more than you'll ever know." Sophie smiled. "I'm really glad, ma'am. You didn't just change. You inspired everyone else too." Mrs. Hale looked down for a moment, then handed her the envelope. "I've started a new foundation," she said. "It's for young women who need help finding opportunities, jobs, education, training. I'd like to offer you a position there. You have leadership, grace, and strength, qualities that can help others. I think you could inspire them the same way you inspired me." Sophie was speechless. "Me? Work for your foundation?" she asked in disbelief. Mrs. Hale nodded with a small smile. "Yes, you taught me what true respect looks like. Now I want to teach others. But I can't do it alone." For a moment, Sophie didn't know what to say. She had never imagined that standing up for what was right would lead to something like this. She finally said, "I'm honored, ma'am, truly. But I love my work here too." Mrs. Hale chuckled softly. "Of course. Think about it. There's no rush. I just wanted you to know the door is open, because you opened mine." When Mrs. Hale left the office, Mr. Peterson turned to Sophie, his eyes wide. "You just got offered a job by the woman who used to make waiters cry," he said, half joking, half amazed. Sophie laughed. Life's funny like that. Over the next few weeks, Sophie thought deeply about it. She loved the crystal spoon, and it had become a family to her. But she also knew Mrs. Hale's offer wasn't just a job. It was a chance to make a bigger difference, to help people who faced the same struggles she once had. One evening, after the dinner rush ended, she gathered the team. "I have something to tell you," she said softly. "I've decided to accept Mrs. Hale's offer." Everyone was silent for a moment. Then one of the waiters smiled sadly. "We'll miss you, Sophie," he said, "but we're proud of you." The chef crossed his arms and nodded. "Go make the world a little kinder, like you did here." The next Friday, Mrs. Hale came again. But this time it wasn't for dinner. She came to meet Sophie on her last day. The two women stood near the entrance, surrounded by the entire staff. "You've done something remarkable," Mrs. Hale said. "You didn't just stand up to me. You reminded me who I used to be. And because of you, I want to help others do the same." Sophie smiled warmly. "Then let's do it together." Mrs. Hale extended her hand, and Sophie shook it. The room filled with applause. For the first time, no one feared Mrs. Hale. They respected her. As Sophie walked out of the crystal spoon that night, the lights glowing behind her, she felt both nervous and excited. The world outside was full of possibilities. She looked up at the night sky and whispered to herself, "One voice can change everything." From that day on, Sophie worked alongside Mrs. Hale in her new foundation. They helped hundreds of young women find jobs, learn new skills, and build confidence. People often asked Mrs. Hale why she started it, and she would always smile and say, "Because once, a waitress taught me the meaning of true respect." Back at the Crystal Spoon, a small plaque hung on the wall near the entrance. It read, "This place changed because one person dared to speak with kindness and courage. Let her example remind us, no one is too small to make a difference." And every time new staff joined, Mr. Peterson would point to that plaque and say, "That's for Sophie, the waitress who changed everything." The story of Sophie and Mrs. Hale became more than a tale about a restaurant. It became a reminder that no matter how powerful or wealthy someone is, kindness and respect are what truly make a person great. And sometimes, all it takes to awaken that truth is one brave heart. Years later, people still talked about the story of the Crystal Spoon, the restaurant where a simple waitress changed a millionaire's wife's heart. It had become something of a legend in the city. New employees often whispered, "Did that really happen?" And the older ones would nod proudly. "Oh yes," they would say. "We were there. We saw everything." The restaurant was still one of the most famous in town, but it was no longer known for its wealthy, difficult customers. Now it was known for its warmth, a place where everyone was treated with respect, no matter who they were. The staff smiled freely, the customers felt welcome, and even the manager, Mr. Peterson, often said, "We're not just serving food anymore. We're serving kindness." Sophie had been gone for almost 3 years. After accepting Mrs. Hale's offer, she had become part of something much bigger. Together, she and Mrs. Hale built the Grace Foundation, an organization that helped young women find jobs, get education, and gain confidence. It started small, just a few offices and a handful of volunteers. But soon, it grew into one of the most respected programs in the city. Every time someone asked how it began, Mrs. Hale would tell the story, honestly, humbly. "Once upon a time," she'd say, "a young waitress looked me in the eye and reminded me that respect is not bought with money. It's earned with humanity." People would listen, often in silence, deeply moved. Mrs. Hale herself had changed completely. The once feared woman now spent her days visiting schools, hosting charity dinners, and personally mentoring women who were struggling. Her husband, Mr. Hale, supported her proudly. Their relationship had healed too. They laughed more, talked more, and even took walks together in the evenings. The ice that had once surrounded their home was gone, melted by the warmth of change. And Sophie, she had become the heart of the foundation. She didn't like to be called a hero, but to many, she was one. Her gentle voice, calm nature, and unwavering kindness inspired everyone who met her. She never raised herself above others. She always said, "I'm just doing what's right." One day, the Crystal Spoon decided to hold a special anniversary dinner to celebrate its 20 years in business. It was going to be a big event, with many old customers and former employees invited. Mr. Peterson, now a little older but still sharp and kind, wanted to make it unforgettable. He made one special call to Sophie. When she answered and heard his voice, she smiled instantly. "Mr. Peterson, how are you?" "I'm wonderful," he said warmly. "But the restaurant misses you, Sophie. We're having our anniversary next month. Would you come back? Just for one night?" Sophie laughed softly. "Of course I'll come. It would be an honor." When the night finally came, the Crystal Spoon looked more beautiful than ever. Fairy lights decorated the windows, the air was filled with the delicious smell of food, and soft music played in the background. The staff was excited, some of them were new, but they had all heard about Sophie. When she walked through the door, the whole place went quiet for a moment. Then people began to smile, whispering, "That's her. That's the one who changed everything." Mr. Peterson hugged her warmly. "It's good to have you back," he said, "even just for tonight." And then, a familiar face walked in, Mrs. Hale. She looked radiant, not because of her jewelry or dress, but because of the kindness that now shone in her eyes. She spotted Sophie and walked over immediately, smiling. "Look at us," Mrs. Hale said softly. "Back where it all began." Sophie laughed. "Yes, it feels like a lifetime ago." They sat together for a while, talking about everything that had happened since that unforgettable night. Mrs. Hale told her how the foundation had helped over 1,000 women find jobs and start new lives. Sophie shared stories about some of the young women who had grown confident and independent through the program. At one point, Mrs. Hale looked around the restaurant and said, "You know, this place doesn't feel the same anymore." Sophie tilted her head. "How do you mean?" Mrs. Hale smiled gently. "Back then, I thought power meant being feared. Now, I see that real power is in being kind." Their conversation was interrupted when Mr. Peterson tapped his glass and stood up to make a speech. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said proudly, "the Crystal Spoon is not just a restaurant. It's a story about courage, kindness, and change. And tonight, we're honored to have the two women who made that story possible, Mrs. Veronica Hale and Miss Sophie Bennett." The crowd burst into applause. Sophie blushed and looked down, but Mrs. Hale squeezed her hand. "You deserve this," she whispered. Mr. Peterson continued, "This restaurant once lived in fear of pride and arrogance. But because of one young waitress's bravery and one woman's willingness to change, we all learned something priceless, that respect, once shared, multiplies." Everyone stood and clapped. Some of the staff even had tears in their eyes. After the applause faded, Sophie stood up to say a few words. Her voice was soft but clear. "I didn't change anything alone," she began. "All I did was speak from my heart. The real change came because someone listened." Mrs. Hale showed that it's never too late to become better, and that one act of kindness can create hundreds more. The entire room was silent for a few moments, touched deeply by her words. Then, applause filled the air again, louder and warmer than before. That night, laughter and joy filled the Crystal Spoon. Old employees reunited. New ones listened in awe, and the restaurant felt alive with gratitude. Mrs. Hale danced with her husband, smiling like a woman who had finally found peace. Sophie stood by the window watching the city lights, feeling proud. Not of herself, but of how far everyone had come. When the night ended, Mrs. Hale hugged Sophie tightly. "You changed my life," she whispered. Sophie smiled and said, "You changed your own life. I just reminded you of who you were." As Sophie left the restaurant and stepped into the cool night air, she looked up at the stars. She thought about how much had happened since that first night. The fear, the courage, the transformation. And she realized something beautiful. Sometimes, a single act of honesty can start a chain reaction that never truly ends. From that night on, people didn't just remember the Crystal Spoon for its fine food or elegant setting. They remembered it as the place where kindness won over pride. And somewhere deep in their hearts, everyone who heard the story learned one simple, powerful truth. No matter how small your voice is, it can still change the world if you speak it with love.